Good evening, everyone. In case you don't know, I'm Melissa from AIM. I'm the Ask an Expert. I am coming to you live tonight to talk about clinical trials and kind of give an overview of what clinical trials are, try to ask or answer, not ask, can't ask myself, some of the most common questions. I'm going to try to hopefully get you very comfortable with what a clinical trial is. I know that you're used to seeing my AIM background if you're someone who tunes in all the time, but I figured since this was from the clinic to the living room, and since we've been doing a little remodeling, I thought it would be kind of cool to show you my actual living room. So there's my fireplace. We just did all that work over there. So background looks a little different tonight. Hi, everybody that's already tuning in. So let's talk about the clinical trials. So what is a clinical trial? Essentially, it's a research study that's being done or performed on, in this case, people to try to get a medical intervention approved or to evaluate the effectiveness of a medical intervention. That's like the textbook definition of this. One of the most common misconceptions about a clinical trial, there's a lot, but one of them is that you're a guinea pig. That's not the case. This is something that every clinical trial, regardless of phase, undergoes an extensive process prior to being allowed to be used on humans. In fact, even before the most early phase 1 trials, which we'll go over in a minute, clinical trials have to go through a process where they have data from essentially a laboratory, either in vivo, so using cell lines where they test different interventions, and then after that on animal models. And the most commonly used one is mouse, because you can induce a melanoma in a mouse model pretty easily. So once data from those things come to show that it is in fact helpful in not only melanoma, but solid tumors and other malignancies, then what they do is actually that data has to sit before a scientific review board, which is a group of physicians and other peers, ethics committees, and they basically look at all of the data to make sure that it's something that would actually be safe for use in a human population. And then once all of that happens and the investigators go back and forth and all the science is reviewed, then it goes in front of what's called an IRB, and they actually are a Human Research Protection Office. They make sure that all research that is done on humans is actually following federal institutional and ethical guidelines. So even before this clinical trial is being presented to you, it's been looked at by a ton of people to make sure that it's safe. So that's one thing. The second thing that I want to talk about in regard to that misconception of being, a guinea pig is that without clinical trials, none of the drugs that are available to melanoma right now would be available. So a really good example of this is over my 15-year career. When I first started in 2005, we had 2 drugs to treat melanoma, one in a metastatic setting and one in an adjuvant or preventative setting. Now there's at least, 13. There's 13 drugs since I started. So, some of the examples are ipilimumab, vemurafenib, cobimetinib, dabrafenib, trametinib, encorafenib, benimatinib, pembrolizumab, nivolumab, the T-VEC drugs, the triplet combination, adjuvant, and then you have some of those drugs that then got approved in an adjuvant setting. So without clinical trials and without the folks that have participated in clinical trials, none of those drugs would be available. So that's one really important thing that I wanted to impress upon folks. It's a very important part of treatment. One of the other misconceptions that people sometimes have are that participating in a clinical trial is their last chance or there's no other options. And that's completely not true. Clinical trials, at least therapeutic clinical trials, oftentimes are a way to get access to drugs that aren't available. We have all of these standard of care medications that we can utilize, but sometimes we think that a combination might work better. And sometimes these combinations aren't available. Or sometimes you've had the few standard of care regimens that we think are appropriate for your disease state, and there aren't any other standard FDA approved things. Most of the clinical trials that are out there right now are really focusing on refractory, on patients that, you know, may have responded a bit to some of the standard of care things, but then they stopped. And so, you know, really clinical trial medicine is driving us forward. To talk about the different phases, I did want to touch on that just a little bit so that people understand when they're signing up for a phase of clinical trial, they know what that actually means. Phase 1 trials are testing entirely new drugs. So these are the earliest stages of human clinical research. They would have shown promise in labs and in animal models. They're usually a very small population, like 15 to 30 patients. Usually they're institutionally driven, meaning that they're specific studies that are being done at like an academic center, like for example, like at my institution. A lot of times they're trying to establish what the most common side effects are, what the best dose is that has the least amount of side effects, and also looking at safety profiles. So phase 1 studies tend to be a little more inclusive in terms of who they allow in their trials, just because they may not always be just for melanoma or just for renal cell or whatever the case may be. They oftentimes include a larger mix of patients. Then phase 2 studies have been likely a phase 1 study at one point or another. They tend to be a little bit larger groups, like say around 100 patients. Here's when we first start to look at efficacy, like how well does this drug actually work in a clinical trial. They continue to evaluate safety profile, continue to evaluate for toxicities. This can be either an institutional trial or sometimes an industry trial at a drug company if things get picked up. When you move on to phase 3 trials, these tend to be a lot larger. They can range from hundreds of patients to thousands of patients. A lot of times the cooperative groups, which are ECOG and SWOG, just to name two, there are a bunch of different institutions that all participate in these larger phase 3 clinical trials, and this really is looking to confirm efficacy in a larger scale. They oftentimes will compare to standard of care. Does that mean that you would get a placebo here? No, it does not. So oftentimes phase 3 trials are an investigational drug that is being tested against something that was already FDA approved. They're gathering a ton of information in this phase. So there's oftentimes biopsies that they want to get, sometimes additional lab work. We're going to talk about all of those things in a minute too. And then phase 4 studies tend to be drugs that are approved after, or they're studies that are like after FDA approval. And a lot of times these are looking at like long-term use and efficacy. They may be looking at quality of life, further statistics regarding toxicity profiles. So, you may see clinical trials in different phases, and each one really does have its benefit to patients. One of the other things that I wanted to kind of mention in terms of clinical trials is that there's not a lot of data out there for groups like mucosal and ocular and patients that have history of brain mets in terms of, how they do in response to a lot of these trials. And there are some trials that are being written that are specific to these groups of people. There's a search tool on our website, and also clinicaltrials.gov is a really great place to look. You can enter in a Boolean search your stage. You can get extremely specific in terms of like region of the country that you live to look for clinical trials that are offered for your specific disease. So that's just a little bit about that. How long will I be in a trial? This is sort of determined by how well you do. So most clinical trials are written with an end date in mind. So most of them are written for like either 1 or 2 years. Does that mean you'll be on trial the entire time? No. So a lot of that depends on scans. Most, all clinical trials have a very specific regimen of when you do certain things. And one of those things is CT scans or PET scans or MRIs or whatever the case may be. And they delineate exactly in the protocol when it should be done. So a lot of times that's 12 weeks. That's a pretty typical time frame, which would be about 3 months. And every scan is compared to the start of study, which is called baseline, and then also to what's called your nadir in a metastatic setting. And what the nadir is when your tumor reaches the lowest point, and that nadir may change as your tumor continues to shrink, we look at how are you now compared to where your tumor was the smallest. If it's the smallest it ever was, then that's your nadir and you're doing great. If you grow from your smallest point, then we know that maybe the drugs are beginning to not work. And so that's something that is used to determine whether or not you're stable, whether or not you're progressing, or whether or not your disease is regressing. There's different responses as part of a clinical trial, and the way that they're described are progressive disease, which is PD, and that means that your tumor is growing more than the standard allowed amount, which is typically 20% from where you started or where you got to the lowest point in your tumor burden. Or there's stable disease, which means that your tumor stayed pretty much the same size as from where it started within a 20% window. So your tumor can actually grow a tiny bit. And the reason for that is they account for error or difference in measurement between scans. So really more than a 20% growth or a 20% decrease truly does mean that your tumor is changing in size. And then, so there's regression, there's progression, which is greater than 20% growth. There's stable disease, which is not really changing. And then there are different levels of response. So there can be a PR or there can be a CR, which is a complete response. Obviously, everyone's goal is a CR, but sometimes it takes some time to get there. So those are just some of the terms that you'll probably hear when you go for your assessment. So how long you stay in a trial depends on how your tumors are doing throughout the treatment. And at each imaging point, they assess those things and they use those terms to describe how you're doing. If you have stable disease or your tumors are shrinking, you'll continue through trial to the next set of scans. Okay, hopefully that makes sense. How will I know if the trial worked? That actually is how, because you'll be scanned at regular intervals to determine whether or not your tumors are growing, staying the same, or shrinking. One of the things that is a little bit complicated for patients sometimes is, how do I know if an adjuvant or preventative trial is working? And truly the answer is if your tumors don't show, like if you don't all of a sudden develop tumors that you didn't have before. So at the start of an adjuvant trial, you really should be without evidence of disease. So if that maintains throughout the trial or throughout the treatment process, then we know that in theory, the drug is working. Okay. Some of the processes that will happen whenever you are presented a clinical trial is that oftentimes your physician or whomever is treating you will present, you have this option. They'll go over it in a little bit of detail, probably tell you how the drug works, tell you what the side effects would potentially be, and give you a little bit of information about schedule. Then most centers or most places that are having clinical trials have what are called clinical research nurses or a clinical research staff. And what their job is to really coordinate your clinical trial care. They become your first point of contact. They're the folks that will actually get you to sign consent for the trial. And that's actually the first step. So signing written informed consent is the start of a clinical trial participation. And what informed consent really is that you have been presented the risks and benefits of the protocol. You understand what the treatment is. You understand how it's given, making sure that you understand any additional things that might be asked of you, like biopsy, blood samples, urine samples, sometimes stool samples. All of those things are or will be delineated on the informed consent. And then once you sign consent, then what's called screening happens. So in order to run a clinical trial, you have to collect all of the data that's pertinent prior to starting. So some of the things that would include would be a pretty detailed history of what treatments you've had in the past, exclusion and inclusion criteria in the trial, because there are some things that folks that run clinical trials, may not want to include in their profile of patients. There is not really a lot of wiggle room in terms of inclusion and exclusion criteria because those were set ahead of time by the researchers. So in the screening process, they'll go over the inclusion and exclusion criteria and make sure all the things fall into those. The clinical research team will set you up for scans. This is pretty typical of every clinical trial. They require specific scans to be done. The investigator that's running the trial will decide what those are. Sometimes it's a PET scan, sometimes it's a CT scan, sometimes MRIs are required to be able to start trial. Definitely labs. Getting baseline labs is extremely important, especially if if there is a developed toxicity or change in the labs throughout the treatment. Oftentimes they'll get an EKG. Sometimes more extensive cardiac testing, like an echocardiogram, where they actually use an ultrasound to look at the pump function of your heart. That will sometimes be done. And all of that is really for your safety, to make sure that, there aren't any things that could potentially become a problem or issue later down the road. The other thing that happens during screening that a lot of people don't know is that we do an insurance verification to make sure that the things that aren't covered by the study, that your insurance will cover so that you're not responsible for those things. Generally speaking, there are different types of studies. Industry studies that are done by or sponsored by drug companies a lot of times will provide the investigational agent that they're trying to study. And that does hold true also for some specific institution-driven studies as well. But the thing that everybody needs to know is that a lot of times, and this isn't true for everything, but a lot of times standard of care things, scans, labs, any agents that are already approved by the FDA, infusion costs, doctor visits, a lot of times those can be billed to the insurance. And so this insurance verification will ensure that your insurance company is willing to pay for these items. If there's some kind of issue during the insurance verification process, that's where we find out. So we're not surprised down the road, you or I or anyone else, if something comes up that isn't covered. A lot of times, with the trial, there's like a checklist and it says all of the different things that potentially will be needed during the trial, and that's submitted to the insurance company. So they already know ahead of time what is required. Okay, so then after screening is done, which sometimes can take anywhere from 2 to 3 weeks, which can sometimes seem like a really long time, and it can be really frustrating to wait. But once that screening process is completely complete, then you would start on the actual therapeutic part of the trial. So I haven't seen any questions come through. I've been watching who is kind of watching. I'm going to scroll back really fast just to make sure I don't lose anybody yet. Hi everybody. I see all of my friends on here. Okay, so the next thing that I kind of want to talk about are the benefits to doing a clinical trial. I kind of covered many of them, but you get access to new drugs that sometimes won't be years to be commercially available. There's the possibility of getting access to potentially a more effective drug. And one really good example of this is that back when ipilimumab had been FDA approved and nivolumab was FDA approved, there was a clinical trial testing the two of them together. And what they actually found out is that doing them together was more efficacious than doing them apart. And so that's one particular example of how a clinical trial helped drive medicine forward, in knowing that, these two drugs are available. Otherwise, physicians couldn't get those two drugs approved to give to you together. The only way to get access to that was through a clinical trial. You may get actually closer monitoring as part of a clinical trial, and this is really the most true in patients that are in adjuvant or neoadjuvant clinical trials. We talked a little bit about adjuvant is when your disease is completely resected and then you get a treatment afterwards to help prevent it from coming back. Neoadjuvant is where you get a little bit of treatment, then they do surgery, and then they do more treatment after. Those clinical trials, typically when patients are being treated adjuvantly, we don't do scans on a regular basis. But as part of a clinical trial, you would have CT scans in a much more frequent manner throughout your treatment. It's pretty standard practice to not do scans on patients that way in an adjuvant setting. The other thing that you may get closer monitoring is for prevention. There are a lot of prevention studies out there that are present that may require, serial biopsies, or for you to take some therapeutic intervention and then have photos taken of your skin. So sometimes participating in a clinical trial will allow you to get a little bit more detailed, closer monitoring than what is standard practice. Obviously, it's a chance to help yourself potentially, but also to help future patients. Again, that goes back to without clinical trials, we wouldn't have any of the drugs that we have now. And then we talked about the benefit of having access to drugs that sometimes are covered without cost to the patient. You do have to know that there are some risks to participating in a clinical trial. But again, these are all gone over in the informed consent process. Verbally, and also given in writing or electronically to you so that you can go back and reference them later. Clinical trials may have a little bit more of a time commitment than some standard of care regimens. The reason for this is that because of the additional monitoring for blood work and extra scans, you may need to be there more frequently for those things, or come for safety visits where we have you come in and kind of talk about how you're doing, what's new, in between your actual infusions or, drug interventions. It's really for the safety of the patient. So those extra time commitments are for your benefit, really. Sometimes patients will have side effects that we can't anticipate. There are, as part of, again, the informed consent process, we go over what the potential side effects are, and those are things that were collected from prior trials, but we don't always know if those are the only ones. So, that is obviously a calculated risk that we take, and sometimes we find new information. Also, the additional testing is sometimes required. Again, that's for your safety. Getting an EKG and an echocardiogram are not part of most standard of care regimens, but again, it's for your safety. And then also, again, the cost is both a risk and a benefit, but the risk is that the standard of care items being billed to your insurance will result in some copays. And again, if you have concerns about those things, that's something to bring up in the informed consent process. It's something to talk to your physician or treating team about. Everyone would be more than happy to make sure that we go over all of those things to allow you access. Okay, I did see a question really fast. Let me run back there. Carrie. So we can talk about this offline, but I see that you were diagnosed with lupus. There are actually clinical trials that are available to folks that have prior autoimmune disorders. So you can contact me. If you go to our website, there's a link for the Ask an Expert line. There's a chat feature also on the website that if you can't find it, they can help you find me. But we can talk offline. I can help you try to find those clinical trials, but those do exist. A really good resource for you would be the clinicaltrials.gov resource, because I think you might be surprised. Okay. Let's see. I think that's it. So what else? I want to also talk about who's going to be in charge of you during a clinical trial. So your treating physician will always be part of your team. When an institution runs or participates in a clinical trial, they sometimes will have a clinical research team, but also the regular care team. Like, for example, at my center, there is a physician assistant that is completely and solely responsible for protocol patients. That's her entire job description. But she collaborates with us. We talk in real time when you see her. If there's an issue, she comes back and we talk about it. And so she's an integral part of our clinical team. So there's never a kind of separation in our sense between standard of care clinical medicine and clinical research. And a lot of times the clinical research team, is just part of the regular treating physician team. So all of those people are available to you if you have issues. Your clinical research nurse or coordinator is a lot of times your point person to call, but certainly, any of the people that are treating you would be helpful. And who's in charge of your care, that kind of answers that question as well, because really your treating physician is still in charge of you, even though you're participating in the clinical trial. Now, if your clinical trial is in a phase 1 department, sometimes that's run by an entirely different person, but the physicians still collaborate with one another. So you are never, you don't break up with your clinical team when you do a clinical trial. Okay. I hope that answers a lot of the questions that people have had about clinical trials. They're really helpful. They, have gained access across the board. If you have issues finding a clinical trial, or there's anything I can do to answer questions that come up after this live is over, you can find me on the Ask an Expert page, available by a form that you fill out that comes to me by email. You can call and leave a message on my hotline. I will get back to you as soon as possible. But yeah, if you need anything, let me know. Also, if you're watching this before October 31st, 2020, you should go to the virtual Halloween Monster Bash. It would be very fun. Okay? Thanks everybody for tuning in. I see a lot of you are folks that have watched before, so thank you for continuing to watch, and we will see you next time. Bye.